Taking leftovers home to your new husband, Linda? I guess some things never change. I said it loudly enough for several guests at my nephew's wedding to hear me, and a few of them laughed. Linda stood beside the catering station, carefully placing untouched slices of prime rib into plastic containers. She stopped, closed the lid, and looked directly at me. I expected embarrassment, maybe anger. Instead, there was only a quiet sadness in her eyes. "No, Michael," she said softly. "Not for my husband." Then she picked up another container and walked away. I should have forgotten about it. Instead, less than an hour later, I was following my ex-wife through the rain at nearly 11 o'clock at night, wondering why those 4 simple words had made me feel like the smallest man in Ohio. And when I discovered where she was taking that food, I would finally understand how badly I had misjudged the woman I'd spent 28 years married to. Before I tell you where Linda was going, subscribe to Darkness Awakens and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And answer this. If your ex-spouse suddenly did something you couldn't explain, would you follow them or decide it was no longer your business? My name is Michael Lawson. I'm 59 years old, retired, divorced, and until that night, I thought I understood exactly why my marriage had ended. 6 years earlier, Linda and I had separated after 28 years together. At the time, I blamed our differences. Linda gave too much. She volunteered on weekends, bought groceries for struggling families, and worried about people I believed should solve their own problems. I worked hard for everything we had, and I thought protecting what was ours made me responsible. Linda believed having enough meant we had a responsibility to help people who didn't. Looking back, we weren't arguing about money. We were arguing about the kind of people we wanted to become. Then I made it worse. I had an affair with a younger woman from work. When Linda discovered it, she didn't scream or throw anything. She sat across from me and asked, "Is this really the life you want?" I said yes. She nodded and replied, "Then I hope you find what you're looking for." The relationship I destroyed my marriage for lasted less than a year. Linda moved on. I stayed in the 4-bedroom house we once imagined, filling with grandchildren. Most mornings, I kept the television running simply because silence made the rooms feel larger. That was the man who walked into the wedding alone that evening and saw Linda again. She looked older, thinner, but unmistakably herself. Instead of enjoying the reception, she was helping the catering staff collect untouched food before it was discarded, and I mocked her for it. After her answer, I watched her differently. She finished packing every container, thanked the catering manager, helped wipe down a table, then carried 2 insulated bags toward the parking lot. Outside, rain was falling hard enough to blur the lights. Linda placed the bags carefully into an old silver Toyota Corolla and checked the time on her phone. Something about the urgency caught my attention. I told myself to leave. Linda's life was no longer my business. But when she pulled out, she didn't head toward the neighborhood where I believed she lived. She drove in the opposite direction. I stood beneath the awning until her taillights disappeared. Then I climbed into my SUV. "Go home, Michael." I actually said it aloud. I started the engine. I could have turned right and been home in 20 minutes. Instead, I turned left. I kept several cars between us as Linda left the country club behind. The streets became narrower, the buildings older, the traffic thinner. Twice I nearly turned around. Following your ex-wife through Columbus at night wasn't something a sensible 59-year-old man should be doing. But this no longer felt like curiosity. It felt like the first time in years I was willing to admit I might have been wrong. After 15 minutes, Linda turned onto a dark street on the west side. I slowed and watched her brake lights disappear into the parking lot beside an aging brick building. I pulled over beneath a tree. Killed M, maybe. It had been believing I understood her when I had never truly bothered to look. I stayed inside my SUV and watched Linda disappear through the side entrance. The building looked like an old church, the kind of place I would normally drive past without noticing. Most of the windows were dark, but a warm yellow light glowed from somewhere downstairs. I was about to leave when the door suddenly opened again. A little boy came running out so fast that a woman behind him called, "Slow down, Leo." He couldn't have been more than 7. He wore sweatpants that were too long for him and a faded red sweatshirt. The moment he saw Linda, his entire face lit up. He ran straight into her and wrapped both arms around her waist. Linda nearly dropped one of the insulated bags. She laughed, knelt in the rain, and hugged him back. I hadn't heard that laugh in years. Then more children appeared behind him. A little girl pressed her face against the glass door. 2 boys stood beside her, watching the bags in Linda's hands. She carried everything inside, and through the window I saw her place the containers on a long folding table. Leo climbed onto a chair beside her. Linda opened the first container. Prime rib. The same food I'd mocked her for saving. Leo's eyes widened. Another child clapped. Linda divided the food carefully onto paper plates while an older woman brought out vegetables and bread. Nobody behaved as though they were receiving leftovers. They behaved as though someone had brought them a feast. I sat frozen behind the steering wheel while the windshield wipers moved back and forth. Suddenly, my joke at the wedding sounded different. Taking leftovers home to your new husband? I had said it because I wanted people to laugh. Linda had taken the humiliation without defending herself, because explaining would have meant turning hungry children into props for her own dignity. That realization hurt more than if she'd slapped me in front of the entire reception. Through the window, I watched Leo take his first bite. Linda didn't make herself a plate. She moved from child to child, cutting meat for the youngest, wiping spilled gravy from the table, making sure everyone else had enough. At one point, Leo held up a piece of prime rib and offered it to her. Linda shook her head and pushed his hand gently back toward his plate. You eat. I couldn't hear the words through the glass, but I knew her well enough to read them on her lips. Or maybe I had never known her at all. For 28 years, I'd watched Linda save food, give money away, volunteer on weekends, and stop for people I considered somebody else's responsibility. I called her naive, wasteful, too trusting. Yet, 6 years after our divorce, with no husband standing beside her and no one from the wedding watching, she was still doing exactly the same thing. There was no audience here, no praise, no reason to impress anyone, just children waiting for dinner. I finally started the engine and drove home. The 4-bedroom house felt different when I walked inside. Bigger, colder. I poured myself a drink but left it untouched. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Leo running toward Linda. Then I heard those people laughing at my joke. Worse, I heard myself laughing with them. I slept maybe 3 hours. By 6 the next morning, I was sitting alone at the kitchen table with coffee growing cold between my hands. Twice I told myself what I'd seen was none of my business. Linda was my ex-wife. Whatever she did with her weekends had nothing to do with me anymore. But another thought wouldn't leave me alone. How many times during our marriage had I mocked something simply because I never bothered to understand it? At 8, I gave up trying to answer. I grabbed my keys and drove to Kroger. I didn't have a plan. I simply started filling a cart. Canned soup, pasta, peanut butter, cereal, bottled water, diapers, paper towels. When the cashier looked at the overflowing cart and asked whether I was preparing for a storm, I almost laughed. No, I said, it's a donation. The words felt unfamiliar coming out of my mouth. 40 minutes later, I was back on the west side of Columbus. In daylight, I could finally read the sign outside the brick building. Grace Community Methodist Church, all are welcome. Beneath it was a handwritten notice. Free community dinner, Tuesday and Saturday. No questions asked. I parked beside Linda's old Corolla and stared at the grocery bags filling my back seat. I still didn't know whether I was there to help those people or simply make myself feel less ashamed. But for once, I decided not to invent an answer before I knew the truth. I picked up the bags, walked toward the side entrance, and opened the door. The side door opened before I could knock. A woman in her 60s, wearing jeans and a faded Ohio State sweatshirt, looked at the grocery bags in my hands, then at me. You here to volunteer? She asked, or just curious? There was no accusation in her voice, which somehow made lying harder. Honestly, I don't know. She studied me for a second, then smiled. That's one of the better answers I've heard. Her name was Carol. She took 2 bags and led me downstairs. The church basement smelled like coffee, laundry detergent, and fresh bread. Nothing matched. Folding chairs came in different colors. The tables were scratched. An old piano against the wall was missing several keys. But the room felt more alive than my four-bedroom house had felt in years. Teenagers wiped tables while arguing about baseball. An Army veteran in a wheelchair played checkers with a little girl. A young mother folded donated clothes near the kitchen. Nobody looked embarrassed to be there. Nobody was being treated like a charity case. Carol pointed toward a storage room. Food goes in there. I had just put down the last bag when I heard a voice I knew immediately. "Morning, Mrs. Jenkins." Linda walked through the hallway carrying a clipboard. She stopped when she saw me. "Michael, I brought some groceries." Her eyes moved toward the shelves behind me. "I can see that." I expected her to ask why I'd followed her. She didn't. I expected some reference to the wedding. Nothing. She simply said, "Thank you," and returned to helping an elderly woman with a walker. Somehow, her refusal to embarrass me made yesterday's joke feel worse. Carol handed me a paper cup of coffee. "You know, Linda, we were married for 28 years. She nearly spilled her drink. "You're Michael." I looked at her. "You've heard about me?" "A little." My stomach tightened. What did she say? Carol thought for a moment. "That you worked hard? That you were a good provider?" I laughed bitterly. "That's generous." She also said pride can make decent people do foolish things. That sounded exactly like Linda. Not cruel enough to condemn someone. Honest enough not to excuse them. I spent the next hour watching her. She unpacked donations, helped an elderly man understand a medication schedule, found a winter jacket for a woman who said hers had been stolen, and sat beside a child struggling with multiplication. She never acted like she was rescuing anyone. She simply noticed what needed doing and did it. Eventually I asked Carol, "How long has she worked here?" Carol laughed. "Worked? We couldn't afford Linda. Then why is she here every day?" "Because she's been volunteering here for 5 years. 5 years. Almost the entire time since our divorce." "What about the catering job?" "Friday nights. Weekends. Sometimes weddings. She needs the extra money." Carol looked at me strangely. "Not for herself." She pointed around the basement. "Medicine, school supplies, utility bills, gas cards, winter coats. Sometimes rent when somebody's about to lose an apartment. Most of what she earns catering comes right back through those doors." I didn't answer. Linda had spent her weekends serving expensive meals to people who barely noticed her, then used the money to help people who couldn't afford their own. Suddenly, the old Toyota made sense. So did the plain clothes. So did those containers of prime rib. As lunchtime approached, the basement filled. A mother apologized when her toddler spilled juice. Linda handed her another cup and said, "No harm done." An older man quietly admitted he couldn't afford his blood pressure medication until payday. Linda slipped an envelope into his pocket. He tried to return it. "Let me win one argument, Frank." He laughed. "You always do." I had seen versions of these moments throughout our marriage. The difference was that back then, I interpreted them through my own values. I thought giving without expecting anything back was foolish. I thought people took advantage of Linda because she let them. Standing in that basement, I began to understand that she had known exactly what generosity cost. She simply believed some things were worth paying for, and nobody there even knew about the insult she'd swallowed at the wedding the night before. Around noon, Linda passed me carrying a box of canned vegetables. "You don't have to stay, Michael." I looked around the room. "Maybe I do." She studied me, perhaps trying to decide what I meant, then continued toward the pantry. I didn't follow her. For once, I wasn't there to demand an explanation or forgiveness. I picked up another box and started stocking shelves. I had spent 6 years telling myself Linda and I had simply wanted different lives. Now, I was beginning to see the truth. She had spent those years building exactly the life she'd always believed in. I was the one who had spent them alone, defending choices that had left me with nothing but a quiet house. And before that day was over, I would discover that Linda hadn't only given her time and money to Grace Community. She had taken responsibility for one life in a way I never could have imagined. Later that afternoon, I found myself repairing a loose cabinet hinge near the church kitchen when the little boy from the night before appeared beside me. "You're the man who brought the food." "Groceries," I corrected. "Miss Linda brought the good food." I laughed despite myself. Fair enough. His name was Leo. Up close, I noticed things I hadn't seen through the rain. The pale skin, the thin arms, and patches where his hair was growing back unevenly. He watched me work as though tightening a hinge was the most interesting thing in Ohio. "Do you know Miss Linda?" he asked. "I've known her a long time." "She's my person." I stopped turning the screwdriver. "Your person?" Leo nodded seriously. "Everybody needs one." Before I could ask what he meant, Linda called him for lunch, and he disappeared down the hallway. An hour later, I stepped outside for some air and heard two volunteers unloading boxes behind the church. They hadn't noticed me. "Leo gained another 3 pounds, one said. Linda almost cried when the doctor told her. The other woman smiled. After everything she went through to get guardianship, that kid deserves some good news. I froze. Guardianship? I waited until they went inside, then found Carol. "Linda is Leo's legal guardian?" Carol's expression changed. "She hasn't told you?" "No." Carol hesitated before answering. Leo's parents had died, leaving him with no stable relative able to take him. He was facing years of foster placements, while dealing with serious health problems. Linda stepped in. "It took almost 18 months, Carol said. Background checks, hearings, home inspections, paperwork. She wouldn't give up. Why? The question left my mouth before I realized how stupid it sounded. Carol looked at me. Because he needed somebody. That was Linda distilled into 5 words. Because he needed somebody. No blood relation, no obligation, no applause. She had simply seen a child who might be left alone, and decided he wouldn't be. I looked through the window. Linda was sitting beside Leo while he worked on a math worksheet. When he solved a problem, she tapped the page and smiled. I remembered the future Linda, and I once imagined grandchildren running through our backyard, noisy Sunday dinners, toys scattered through the house. I'd helped destroy that future, and somehow she had still found a way to give a child a home. Before I could process it, a black SUV pulled into the parking lot. A tall man in a navy blazer stepped out. I recognized him immediately. Greg Vance, my former business partner, the man I hadn't spoken to in 7 years. Volunteers greeted him warmly. One shook his hand and said, "Mr. Vance, thank you again for supporting the program." I glanced toward the entrance and noticed a banner. Community dinner generously supported by the Greg Vance Foundation. Greg had always loved having his name on things. Buildings, charity checks, awards. Back when we worked together, I considered that ambition. Now, after spending a day watching Linda help people who barely knew where her money came from, the contrast was impossible to miss. Then I looked at Linda. The instant she saw Greg, her entire body changed. The warmth disappeared from her face. She took Leo gently by the shoulder, handed her clipboard to Carol, and led him toward a side hallway. "Why is she leaving?" I asked. Carol didn't answer. Greg entered the building smiling, shaking hands, asking volunteers about the food pantry. He looked exactly as I remembered him, polished, confident, comfortable being admired. But my attention remained on the hallway where Linda had disappeared with Leo. She wasn't behaving like a woman who simply disliked an old acquaintance. She was deliberately keeping the boy away from Greg. A few minutes later, Greg spotted me. Surprise flashed across his face before the politician's smile returned. Michael Lawson. Now that's a face I haven't seen in a long time. He offered his hand. I shook it. "Didn't know you were involved here." "My foundation supports a lot of community work." He glanced toward the hallway. "Linda still volunteering?" The casual way he said her name bothered me. "You know she is?" "Columbus isn't that big." He smiled again, but something behind it felt rehearsed. "Good seeing you, Michael." Then he moved on. I watched him until he left. Only after his SUV disappeared did Linda return with Leo. She didn't ask what Greg had said to me. She simply resumed working as though nothing had happened. But I had known Linda for 28 years. She could hide anger. She could swallow humiliation. Fear was different. And whatever existed between Linda and Greg had made her protect Leo before she protected herself. That evening, I sat in my SUV staring at Greg's foundation banner through the windshield. The day had begun, with me trying to understand why Linda saved wedding food. Now, I had a much larger question. Why did my ex-wife want a 7-year-old boy nowhere near the man I had once trusted more than I trusted her? The next morning, I called a man I hadn't spoken to in nearly 10 years. David Collins had worked beside Greg and me from the early days of Midstate Construction Supply, and if anyone could explain why Linda wanted Leo away from Greg, it was him. David answered on the fourth ring. Michael? Yeah. There was a pause. I wondered when you'd call. That wasn't the response I expected. Why? Because I heard you saw Greg. 2 hours later, I was sitting on David's back patio in Westerville with coffee between us. I told him about the wedding, Grace Community, Leo, and the way Linda had reacted when Greg appeared. David listened without interrupting. When I finished, he leaned back. Michael, there's something you should have known years ago. I'm discovering that's a long list. He didn't smile. Do you remember Linda coming to your office one Friday with a folder? At first, I didn't. Then an image surfaced. Linda, standing outside my office, holding papers against her chest. I had told her I was busy. What was in it? David looked directly at me. Fake invoices. I stared at him. What? Linda found payments to subcontractors that didn't make sense. Companies billing us for work nobody could verify. She thought Greg was stealing. My first instinct was still resistance. Linda wasn't an accountant. No. But she handled your household tax records. Some company documents came home with you. She compared numbers and noticed things we missed. David went inside and returned carrying an old binder. He opened it to copies of vendor payments. Several company names looked vaguely familiar. Shell vendors, he said. Invoices went through them for work that either never happened or was massively inflated. Why didn't accounting catch it? Some people did. He paused. Linda caught it first. My stomach tightened. Then another memory returned. Linda standing in our kitchen with papers spread across the counter. Michael, I think Greg is stealing. I remembered laughing. Greg is my partner. You don't understand the business. She had pushed the documents toward me. I hadn't even read them. How many times did she try to tell me? I asked. At least 3 that I know of. David's answer barely rose above a whisper. And every time, Greg found out. How? Probably you. That hurt because he was right. Whenever Linda raised concerns, I went directly to Greg. I thought that was loyalty. Greg responded by turning her concern into a joke. David reminded me of conversations I'd buried for years. Greg telling employees Linda was becoming paranoid. Greg suggesting marital stress had affected her judgment. Greg joking that she'd eventually accuse him of stealing the office furniture. And me laughing along. Then David mentioned the company Christmas party. I didn't need help remembering that one. Greg had approached us with a drink and said, "Your wife's still chasing conspiracy theories." People laughed. I put my arm around his shoulder and replied, "Don't worry, I'll keep her away from accounting." Linda had been standing only a few feet away. I could suddenly see her expression with painful clarity. She hadn't looked angry. She'd looked finished. She stopped trying after that, David said. I stared down at the binder. For 6 years, I'd told myself our marriage ended because of my affair. That was easier, strangely enough. One unforgivable act. One clear cause. But the truth was worse. The affair hadn't destroyed something healthy. It had finished something I'd been weakening for years. Linda had brought me evidence that the man I trusted might be stealing from us, and instead of listening, I helped that man humiliate her. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. David's face hardened slightly. "Some of us tried. You weren't interested in hearing anything that contradicted Greg. I couldn't argue. Greg had made me feel successful, important, respected. Linda had asked uncomfortable questions. I chose the person who protected my ego." David closed the binder. "When you took early retirement, you thought the company's financial problems were the economy. That's what Greg told me. Greg told everybody a lot of things. Are you saying he pushed me out? I'm saying I never believed you knew the whole story. I drove home with the radio off. Every few miles, another memory returned. Linda asking me to look at numbers, Greg dismissing her, me defending him. By the time I reached my driveway, the question from yesterday had changed completely. I had wondered why Linda didn't want Leo near Greg. Now I wondered what else she knew about him and how much damage my refusal to believe her had allowed him to do. 3 days later, my phone rang. Carol's name appeared on the screen. The moment I answered, I knew something was wrong. "Michael," she said, "Linda won't ask you for help, but I will." I stood slowly. "What happened?" Carol hesitated. "Someone is coming after the church." Someone is coming after the church. Carol's words stayed in my head as I drove toward Grace Community. When I arrived, Linda was already in the basement with Carol and 2 members of the church board. A map of the neighborhood covered the table. Several properties surrounding the church had been circled in red. Linda looked at me. "Carol called you?" She thought I should know. "This isn't your problem, Michael. 6 years earlier, that sentence would have been enough for me to leave." This time, I pulled out a chair. "Tell me anyway." Carol pointed to the map. Over the previous 8 months, 3 properties bordering church land had been purchased by different limited liability companies. A vacant storefront to the east, an old repair garage behind the church. Then a narrow parking lot Grace Community had leased for years during community dinners. The names were different, but the timing wasn't. "Our lease on that parking lot ends in 60 days, Carol said. "The new owner won't renew. So use the church lot." Linda shook her head. "We can't." On busy evenings, Grace Community needed the additional spaces to satisfy occupancy and zoning requirements. Without them, the church might have to reduce the number of people it served. The food pantry, shelter beds, tutoring program, and community dinners could all be affected. "Who owns the LLCs?" I asked. "That's what we don't know." Linda folded the map. "And before you say it, no, we don't have proof Greg is involved." The fact that she'd mentioned his name before I did told me she suspected exactly what I suspected. I spent the afternoon tracing public business records. One LLC led to a registered agent. That agent appeared on another company. A mailing address connected that company to a property management firm. The chain was deliberately boring, exactly the kind of paperwork most people would stop following. I didn't. By evening, one name finally appeared behind the management structure. Vance Development Holdings, Greg. I printed everything and drove back to the church. Linda was alone in the kitchen, stacking canned goods. I placed the documents on the counter. She looked at the final page and closed her eyes. I knew it. Why would Greg care about this place? He doesn't care about the church. Then what does he want? The block. She explained that developers had been circling the neighborhood for years. New apartments and commercial projects were moving west. Grace Community occupied one of the largest remaining parcels. If Greg controlled enough surrounding property, he could make operating there increasingly difficult until selling became the easiest option. Has he offered to buy? Twice. How much? Enough that some board members think we should take it. I looked toward the basement where volunteers were preparing dinner. "And then what happens to everyone who comes here?" Linda's answer was quiet. "They find somewhere else." We both knew what that really meant. Some would, some wouldn't. Leo appeared in the doorway carrying a math book. "Miss Linda, can you help me?" 2 minutes. He disappeared again. I looked at her. "Does he know?" "No." "Know what?" "That if we lose this place, everything changes." For the first time, I understood why Greg's arrival had frightened her. Grace Community wasn't merely a building Linda volunteered in. It was the center of a network, holding fragile lives together. Greg saw acreage. Linda saw people. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "Fight the zoning changes. Raise money. Find another parking arrangement." "And if Greg keeps buying?" She looked at me with the same stubbornness I'd once mistaken for naivety. "Then we keep fighting." I thought about David's binder, fake invoices, shell vendors. Linda warning me 3 times while I defended Greg. 20 years earlier, she'd stood alone with evidence in her hands, and I had chosen the easier person to believe. I wasn't going to make that mistake twice. I know construction law. I know property records. And I know how Greg operates. Linda immediately shook her head. "Michael, don't turn this into some crusade because you feel guilty. It isn't about guilt. Then what is it?" I looked through the doorway at Leo, bent over his homework, while volunteers set tables around him. "You tried to warn me about Greg once. I didn't listen." Linda said nothing. "I'm listening now." She studied me for several seconds. "And what exactly are you planning?" "Nothing reckless." I gathered the LLC records from the counter. I'm going to find out what Greg is doing. Michael, if he's simply buying property legally, that's where it ends. But if the man David remembers is still operating the same way, there will be records somewhere. Linda's expression changed at David's name, but she didn't ask what he'd told me. I headed toward the door. Where are you going? To do something I should have done 20 years ago. What's that? I looked back at her. Check the evidence before I decide who to believe. The next morning, I sat across from attorney Rachel Myers, with David's binder and the property records spread between us. Rachel had handled business disputes for nearly 30 years, and she wasn't interested in my guilt, my marriage, or my opinion of Greg Vance. She wanted facts. Shell companies aren't illegal, she said. Buying property around a church isn't illegal either. What about fake invoices? If they're fake, prove it. That answer was exactly what I needed. For the next 3 weeks, I stopped trying to prove Greg was a bad man and started trying to prove specific transactions had never been legitimate. David gave me the first name, Janet Miller, our former payroll supervisor. She agreed to meet only after Rachel assured her we weren't asking her to make accusations. Janet arrived carrying an old cardboard file box. I kept these because something never made sense, she said. Inside were vendor logs, payroll summaries, and photocopies of invoices from the final years before my retirement. Several vendors matched the companies Linda had questioned decades earlier. Rachel selected one invoice. Ridgeway Industrial Services. $47,000 for warehouse labor. Janet nodded. That's why I kept it. We didn't use outside warehouse labor that month. Another invoice showed equipment rental from a company none of us remembered seeing on a job site. A third billed mid-state for freight on deliveries that didn't appear in our receiving logs. One suspicious invoice could be an error. 10 began to look like a system. Janet gave us another name, then another. Within days, I was sitting in diners and living rooms with people I'd once employed. A former warehouse manager remembered being ordered to approve delivery forms for shipments he never physically received. A purchasing clerk recalled Greg insisting certain vendors bypass the normal approval process. One driver remembered being assigned to collect equipment from a warehouse address that turned out to be almost empty. I told Greg, he said. He told me paperwork wasn't my job. Rachel documented everything. David compared the statements against the old vendor records. Slowly, dates began matching. Companies Linda had questioned were connected to payments. Other employees had also considered suspicious. The hardest part wasn't discovering Greg might have stolen from the company. It was discovering how many chances I'd had to notice. Every witness brought back another piece of the man I used to be. I remembered dismissing Janet when she questioned overtime figures. I remembered telling warehouse staff to follow Greg's instructions because he understood expansion better than they did. Greg hadn't operated in complete darkness. He'd operated behind my confidence in him. In the evenings, I went to Grace Community. I didn't tell Linda what we'd found. Rachel had warned me not to spread incomplete allegations, and for once I followed advice before my pride interfered. Instead, I fixed things. A broken shelf, a leaking faucet, a loose handrail near the basement stairs. Leo usually appeared within minutes, carrying whatever tool he thought I needed. "Why do you always know how to fix stuff?" he asked one afternoon. "Because I've broken enough things. Miss Linda says breaking something doesn't mean you can't fix it." I stopped tightening the bolt. "She said that?" "Yeah." He handed me a wrench. "But she says some things don't go back exactly the same." I looked across the room at Linda sorting donated coats. "She's right about that too." The investigation kept growing. Rachel traced 2 former vendors to dissolved corporations. David found matching addresses between companies that supposedly competed for contracts. Janet located payment dates that corresponded with periods when Midstate was supposedly suffering cash shortages. Money had been leaving while Greg told me the company needed layoffs and cutbacks. But we still had a problem. The records suggested fraud. They didn't yet show where the money ultimately went. "We need something closer to the source," Rachel said. "Bank records, internal ledgers, somebody who saw both sides." David became quiet. Then he said, "There might be one person." "Who?" He hesitated. "Harold Simmons." I remembered the name immediately. Harold had been Midstate's senior accountant before retiring. Quiet man, thick glasses, never trusted computers. He recorded numbers by hand even after everyone else moved to spreadsheets. He's still alive? 81. Assisted living outside Dublin. Why hasn't anyone talked to him? David looked at me. Because Greg made sure Harold left believing nobody wanted to hear what he knew. That sentence hit too close to home. The following morning, David and I drove to see him. On the way, Rachel called with one warning. Don't lead him. Don't tell him what you want to find. Ask what he remembers, and let him show you. When we arrived, Harold was sitting beside a window reading the newspaper. He recognized David first, then looked at me for a long moment. Michael Lawson, he said. Took you long enough? I pulled up a chair. Long enough for what? Harold folded the newspaper carefully to start asking the right questions. Then he reached toward the drawer beside his chair. There's something I've kept for a very long time. Harold Simmons opened the drawer beside his chair and pulled out a black notebook held together by a cracked elastic band. It looked completely ordinary. No company logo, no official markings. Just a worn ledger thick with yellowing pages. He placed it between us and rested one hand on the cover. Greg trusted computers, he said. I never did. David leaned forward. What's in there? Harold looked at me. The numbers your wife tried to make you look at 20 years ago. I felt my stomach tighten. He opened the ledger. Every page was covered with dates, account numbers, vendor names, check numbers, and handwritten totals. Some names were already familiar from Janet's records. Ridgeway Industrial Services, Franklin Equipment Leasing, Buckeye Freight Solutions. Harold had recorded payments beside them, then drawn arrows toward account numbers I didn't recognize. Why did you keep this? I asked. Because the numbers in the computer kept changing. He explained that during his final years at Midstate, invoices would sometimes be approved for one amount and later appear differently in internal reports. Vendor addresses changed. Payment descriptions were edited. Supporting records disappeared. Harold began copying suspicious transactions by hand. Greg told me I was too old to understand the new system, he said. Maybe he was right about the system, but arithmetic hasn't changed much. David almost smiled. Harold turned several pages and pointed to a series of payments. These companies supposedly provided different services: labor, freight, equipment, consulting. But look where the money went. The destination account numbers repeated. Different vendors, same financial endpoints. Rachel's warning echoed in my head. Don't lead him. So I asked only, what did you think was happening? Harold answered without hesitation. Money was being moved out of Midstate through companies that existed mostly on paper. Did you tell anyone? Greg? What did he say? That if I wanted my retirement package, I should stop seeing crimes in accounting errors. Harold looked at me over his glasses. I considered telling you. Why didn't you? His expression said the answer before he spoke. Because by then everyone knew what happened when Linda tried. I looked down at the ledger. Even 20 years later, my refusal to listen was still casting a shadow. Harold closed the book. Computers can disappear, Michael. Files can be altered. He tapped the cover with one finger, but ink lasts. With Harold's permission, Rachel had the entire ledger professionally copied and documented. Over the next several days, she compared it against Janet's vendor logs, surviving Midstate records, corporate registrations, property filings, and statements from former employees. The pattern became stronger with every comparison. Shell vendors received payments for questionable work. Several companies shared addresses, officers, or banking connections. Transfers moved through layers before reaching accounts associated with Greg's business network. When David and I totaled the transactions that could still be supported by surviving documentation, the number approached $2 million. I stared at the spreadsheet Rachel had prepared. He stole almost $2 million? Careful, she said. We have evidence suggesting funds were diverted. Investigators decide what can be charged. But this is enough to take to them? More than enough to ask serious questions. For the first time, Greg wasn't protected by my memory or Linda's suspicions. We had Janet's records, former employees, corporate filings, property connections, and Harold's handwritten ledger tying transactions together across years. Then Greg made a mistake none of us expected. He announced his candidacy for county commissioner. His campaign video showed him standing in front of a renovated community center talking about integrity, responsible development, and protecting Columbus families. Near the end, photographs appeared of charities his foundation supported. One of them was Grace Community Methodist Church. I watched Linda's church being used as evidence of Greg Vance's generosity, while his development company was quietly surrounding it with property. Something inside me hardened. That evening, I showed Linda the announcement. "Don't do anything stupid," she said immediately. "I'm serious, Michael. Rachel has the ledger." Linda went still. "What ledger?" Harold Simmons kept records. I watched recognition move across her face. Harold believed me? Apparently before I did. Linda looked away. That was a long time ago. Not for Greg. He's still using the same reputation to get what he wants. And what exactly do you want? I thought about that carefully. 6 years earlier, I might have said revenge. 3 weeks earlier, maybe redemption. Neither answer felt right anymore. I want the truth where he can't bury it. 2 days later, Greg's campaign announced a public town hall 5 days before the election. Questions from residents would be taken from the floor. I forwarded the announcement to Rachel. She called almost immediately. "Michael, if you're thinking what I think you're thinking, we do this carefully." Agreed. No speeches. No accusations you can't support. Then we won't accuse him. I looked at the copy of Harold's black ledger on my desk. We'll ask him to explain the numbers. 5 days before the election, Greg Vance walked onto the town hall stage beneath a banner that read, "Integrity. Growth. Community." Nearly 300 people filled the auditorium, including local reporters and 2 television crews. I sat in the 4th row beside Rachel and David with 3 copied pages from Harold's black ledger folded inside my jacket. 20 years earlier, I would have applauded Greg. That night, I waited for questions from the audience. When the moderator finally opened the floor, I stood. Greg recognized me immediately. "Michael Lawson," he said with a politician's smile. "My old business partner." A volunteer handed me the microphone. "Greg, in March 2004, Midstate paid Ridgeway Industrial Services $47,000 for warehouse labor. Our payroll records show no outside crew worked that month. What was the payment for?" His smile tightened. "Michael, you're asking me to remember one invoice from 20 years ago? Then let's try another." I held up the second page. Buckeye Freight Solutions received more than $80,000, but the receiving logs show no matching deliveries. Can you explain that? The room became quiet. Greg looked toward the audience and sighed. "My former partner has had a difficult few years. I'm not going to turn a community event into a stage for personal grievances." I almost laughed. It was exactly what he'd done to Linda. Don't answer the evidence. Attack the person presenting it. 20 years ago, I'd helped him do it. Not tonight. "You're right," I said. "Nobody should trust my memory." Greg relaxed slightly. "That's why I brought the accountant who recorded the transactions when they happened." Heads turned toward the back of the auditorium. David stood and helped Harold Simmons to his feet. At 81, Harold needed a cane, but the worn black ledger beneath his arm was enough to erase Greg's smile. Harold reached the microphone and introduced himself as Midstate's former senior accountant. He opened the ledger and read several dates, vendor names, check numbers, and destination accounts. "Electronic records kept changing," Harold said. "So I wrote down what I saw." Greg interrupted. "A handwritten notebook proves nothing." Harold looked at him calmly. "Then explain why the bank account numbers a match." Reporters immediately began taking notes. Greg tried another attack, calling Harold an elderly former employee, relying on decades-old memories. Harold didn't blink. "My memory isn't the evidence. The numbers are." Then a woman stood 3 rows behind me, Janet Miller. "And I still have the payroll records," she said. The room erupted in whispers. Janet identified invoices for labor that had never appeared on company payroll schedules. A former warehouse manager stood next and confirmed delivery forms for shipments he never received. Then a former driver described being sent to a warehouse that was almost empty, despite invoices showing substantial equipment movement. I hadn't asked any of them to speak that night. They simply stopped being afraid once someone else went first. Greg's expression hardened. These are disgruntled former employees being coordinated by a bitter ex-partner. A reporter called from the aisle. Mr. Vance, were any of these vendor accounts connected to businesses you controlled? Another asked whether his campaign would release financial records. Then someone asked about the LLC's purchasing property around Grace Community Methodist Church. Greg stopped answering. The moderator ended the event early, but by then it didn't matter. Cameras followed Greg toward a side exit while reporters surrounded Harold and Janet. Rachel made one thing clear to every journalist who approached us. The records had already been preserved and provided to the proper authorities. 48 hours later, state investigators requested documents connected to several vendors. Federal authorities began reviewing financial transactions and tax records. Greg canceled 2 campaign appearances, then announced he was suspending his campaign. His foundation removed material from its website, and Vance Development stopped answering questions about the properties surrounding Grace Community. Over the following months, investigators compared Harold's ledger with bank records, Janet's documents, corporate registrations, and sworn statements from former Midstate employees. The shell vendors were no longer isolated names on old invoices. Investigators could trace money through entities associated with Greg's business network. Eventually, Greg was indicted on charges involving financial fraud, tax evasion, and falsification of business records. I read the announcement alone at my kitchen table. For years, I'd imagined that proving Linda right would somehow make my own failure smaller. It didn't. Greg might finally have to answer for what he'd done, but no indictment could erase the night Linda placed evidence in front of me, and I chose to laugh with him instead. I called her anyway. They indicted Greg. I heard. You were right about him. Linda was silent for several seconds. Then she said quietly, Michael, I didn't need Greg to be arrested to know I was right. I closed my eyes. I know. After we hung up, I looked at the newspaper photograph of Greg leaving the town hall surrounded by reporters. Bringing him down should have felt like victory. Instead, I finally understood something more difficult. Exposing Greg could correct an old injustice. It could not undo the man I had been when Linda needed me to believe her. That part couldn't be repaired in a courtroom. And for the first time, I knew exactly where I needed to go next. The place I needed to go was Grace Community. By then, Greg's development pressure around the church had weakened, but I kept showing up long after there was anything left for me to investigate. At first, I repaired whatever Carol pointed at. Shelves, faucets, broken chairs, a section of fence behind the kitchen. Eventually, nobody needed to ask. Tuesday and Saturday simply became the nights I was there. Leo usually found me before I'd put down my toolbox. Michael, this one's broken. Sometimes it was a toy, sometimes a bicycle. Sometimes nothing was actually wrong and he simply wanted someone beside him. I began helping with homework too, though Leo quickly discovered I was better with tools than 5th grade grammar. Linda watched all of it without commenting. She never treated my volunteering as payment for what I'd done, and I stopped treating it that way too. I wasn't there to earn forgiveness. I was there because, for the first time in years, being useful to someone else felt better than proving I was important. Emily noticed the change before I mentioned it. One Sunday, she and Ryan came to the church with their children and found me repairing a pantry shelf while Leo handed me screws. Emily stared at me. Who are you, and what have you done with my father? I laughed. Very funny. Then her expression softened. Mom said you've been coming every week. Your mother says too much. No, Dad. For years, she barely said anything about you. That hurt more. Ryan eventually started joining me for coffee. The conversations were awkward at first, but slowly my children stopped waiting for the old Michael to return. Months passed. Then Father's Day arrived. Grace Community held a small lunch after the service. I was stacking chairs when Leo walked toward me, holding a folded piece of construction paper. This is for you. Why? Just open it. Inside, he'd drawn 2 stick figures standing beside a badly drawn toolbox. Underneath, in uneven handwriting, he'd written, "Thank you for always showing up." I couldn't speak. Leo looked worried. You don't like it? I pulled him against me before he could finish. It's perfect. Over his shoulder, I saw Linda watching from across the room. She smiled, but there were tears in her eyes too. That afternoon, after everyone left, I found her outside near the church garden. For months, I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say. Standing beside her, none of the rehearsed words mattered. "Linda, I'm sorry." She looked at me quietly. "Not just for the affair, for Greg. For laughing when you were trying to protect us. For treating your kindness like weakness because it made me uncomfortable. For making you feel foolish when the fool was me." Linda looked toward the church. "I've forgiven you, Michael." I swallowed. "Then maybe we could start again." She closed her eyes briefly. When she looked back at me, there was tenderness in her expression, which somehow made the answer harder. "No," I nodded, but she continued. "I love the man you're becoming. And I'm grateful you finally see what I was trying to tell you." She reached for my hand. "You finally became the man I always hoped you could be. I just needed you 20 years earlier. There was no cruelty in it. That was what made it final. 6 years ago, I would have argued. I would have explained how much I'd changed, how much good I'd done, how unfair it was that none of it earned me another chance. But that man was exactly the person Linda had needed to leave. So I squeezed her hand and said, 'I understand.' And for once, I actually did. Redemption isn't a receipt you hand someone in exchange for getting your old life back. Apologies don't erase consequences. Becoming better don't obligate the people you hurt to return. Sometimes the only reward for finally doing the right thing is becoming someone capable of doing it again tomorrow." I never remarried Linda, but I didn't disappear from her life either. We became something quieter. Friends, eventually. Emily and Ryan started bringing the grandchildren over more often. Leo kept giving me broken things to repair, and sometimes Linda would laugh and tell him he was deliberately breaking them just to keep me busy. Maybe he was. My house stopped feeling quite so empty. Months later, I stood in the Grace Community kitchen watching volunteers prepare another Saturday dinner. Linda was across the room helping a mother pack food into containers to take home. Years earlier, I would have called that woman irresponsible. I would have asked why she couldn't provide for herself. Now, I simply picked up another container and helped fill it. That's when I finally understood the lesson Linda had been trying to teach me for most of our marriage. Compassion isn't weakness. Forgiveness isn't reconciliation. And redemption doesn't mean getting back what you lost. Sometimes, redemption is finally becoming the person you should have been, even when the people you hurt have already learned how to live without you.